Honestly guys, I don't know how to cover this. Even in my TLDR videos, I've never really talked about the Guardian Druid rotation. And why, you may ask? Well, honestly, it's stupid simple. You pretty much thrash, mangle, you just hit random buttons until thrash and mangle come off a cooldown. But while I was driving to my local Starbucks to get my typical white girl beverage, it occurred to me that the rotation becomes quite complex in several different situations, which are then affected by the amount of mobs that you're pulling, the instance or content that you're in, or the composition you're running with. So right here and right now, I'm going to try to cover all the different situations that will affect your rotation and what you should prioritize when it comes to spells. Before I dive into this clusterfuck of a video, I want to preface this with that I will not be going over weaving, because it adds a lot of additional layers to the rotation that can change simply based on your preference or the content that you're doing, so maybe in a future video. But anyways, this video is going to strictly cover how to maximize your damage while in bear form, mainly in Mythic Plus content, but it can also probably be applied to raid, so let's go. It's fair to say that this is the most boring rotation you'll ever do. I will quickly talk about what is important to maintain. More often than not, you will always want to start the pull with Moonfire. And this is because the damage over time effect you're going to want to maintain through the rest of the fight. Following this, you're going to want to apply your Thrash first, since, your Mangle does increase damage to bleeding targets, and as any third grader could probably guess afterwards, you're going to follow your Thrash with a Mangle. Keeping to a full single target patchwork rotation, you will want to fill in with Swipe until either A, Thrash and Mangle are off a cooldown, or B, you want to reapply your Moonfire. This can be done between 1 and 6 seconds left on the debuff, preferably. This is just the tip of the iceberg though when it comes to maximizing damage potential. Gore procs will automatically shift your rotation and should be used as often as they appear. If you're running the Galactic Guardian talent option, Moonfire procs should also be used as they happen. Lastly, if you're kiting a mob or pack, make sure you are maximizing your globals to maintain damage and threat by spamming Moonfire while tab targeting, but this isn't really relevant in single target encounters. How should Berserk and Incarnation be used? Now, these should be used as seen fit, whether it is to improve your damage, paired with larger pulls or on a certain boss fight for better single target damage, or as a defensive. Though, since we are talking about single target damage, this should not change your rotation much unless you're running Ursoc's Fury Remembered or Lufa Infuse Embrace, which are both Thrash-based legendary powers. If this is the case, your Thrash cast should be prioritized since they will effectively do more damage and should be spammed. But this is where the water gets murky. If you find that you are also taking a lot of damage during this time, Mangle should be used to gather rage to spend on Iron Fur. Luckily during this window though, the cast of Iron Fur is reduced, so it is far easier to maintain the few stacks you will want to have so you can focus on eking out a little bit more damage. Now, to address the biggest misconception of the Guardian Druid rotation, and that is, should you ever hit Maul? I've seen a lot of guides and players saying that you should not even put this ability on your bar, let alone press it. While I can meet them in the middle and say it's a very rare occurrence when you will need to actually hit Maul, never is definitely not the best suggestion. Obviously, there are a lot of issues with Maul that I think Blizzard needs to address, like the rage cost or the amount of damage that it deals. It's a relatively lackluster spender and only gets modified if taken the talent option Tooth and Claw, but this is rarely the case since the Rend and Tear talent option is so powerful in today's meta. Since there are no additional modifiers, it is fair to say pressing it could cost you your life, your in-game life that is. My recommendation when using this ability falls into two categories. The first category is if you're comfortable with the damage taken profile that is queued, and you have appropriate damage mitigation active for said incoming damage. So during certain boss fights, if the tank damage is low enough or magic based, this is where you can spend that excess rage on Maul to help the boss die faster. A good critical hit of this ability can chunk for anywhere between 4,000 and 5,000 damage, which is not an insignificant amount for a global cost. The second time you should hit Maul, I'm going to talk about in my multi-target section here in a few seconds, so stay tuned for that. I want to quickly note Covenant abilities here, since they can affect your rotations lightly. Notably, if you're playing Necrolord, Adaptive Swarm should obviously be used on cooldown for maximum effectiveness. This is probably the biggest game changer when it comes to the single target rotation. All the other Covenants don't really matter as much. Ravenous Frenzy for Venthyr is often paired with Berserk and Incarnation, so this should be kind of a no-brainer when you should actually use Ravenous Frenzy. Convoke the Spirits for Night Fae and Kindred Spirits for Kyrian are a little less restrictive and should be used as seen fit. Kindred Spirit gets slightly complicated depending on who you're bonded with, so you're going to need to keep that in mind when playing with this Covenant. Convoke can be used to pump a lot of damage or healing or even generating a lot of rage or threat, so when you as a player should use this really comes down to your comfort level in tanking any single target encounter. But I think that pretty much does it for the single target aspect of this class. If you have any additional questions, let me know in the comment section below and I'll do a quick recap at the end of this video. But for now, the multi-target rotation. Get ready for some crazy rambling. When I'm referring to this section of the video, I am talking about all combat situations where there will be more than one target. This can both be for boss fights with additional adds that are going to be brought into the encounter, which we see several times in different dungeons, or any given trash pull during a dungeon where there's going to be more than one target. I just want to make this extremely clear for people who miss out on me explaining this, so when I tell you just to spam thrash forever, I don't get any hate in the comments. Alright, so what should your rotation look like? Well, when talking strictly about rotation, nothing much will actually change besides the priority of spells and the importance of Moonfire. When approaching multiple mobs, keep in mind the cooldown of Thrash, and if you decide to pick up multiple packs at the same time. Try to gather mobs first using Moonfire and Swipe before hitting your Thrash, since you want to apply the Thrash debuff to as many targets as possible, since Rend and Tear means they're going to be doing reduced damage to you. Thrash is also an uncapped ability, meaning that it'll hit as many targets that are in range. This is important to keep threat at the start of a pull. Mangle will then be used on cooldown or as often as possible to generate rage. Most players will actually then default to Swipe, which isn't bad, but it's capped at 5 targets, which means that it'll be less effective once the amount of mobs reaches 6 or more targets. This brings me to the importance of Moonfire. The value of a single Moonfire is worth roughly 18% more than the average Swipe. While testing out the damage of these two abilities, my average Swipe was hitting for 630 damage. Hitting 5 targets for non-critical strikes meant that the value of a 5-target Swipe was worth 3,150 damage. My average Moonfire non-critical hit was hitting for 350 average during the duration of the 15-second damage over time effect, which resulted in a total of 3,850 damage. So why is this important? It simply means that a proper Moonfire application and maintenance can result in a higher overall damage, which is obviously extremely beneficial to both raid encounters and getting through a time-based instance like Mythic Plus. Also, Moonfire is just unaffected by pull size. So when should you hit Swipe versus Moonfire? Well, this is an extremely good question, since it's very convoluted in its entirety. Whether direct damage or indirect damage will be more important at any given point. While it would be preferred to apply Moonfire to every target in a pull, sometimes it is just not practical to manage. Since Thrash and Mangle will typically take precedence over every other ability, this means you will have roughly 3 globals worth of abilities to use before Thrash is off of cooldown. More often than not, hitting multiple mobs will be better for threat generation and stability than just hitting one. In this case, Swipe should be used earlier in pulls to establish threat. Moonfire can be later applied to solidify and maintain threat while kiting mobs while still doing damage. My best suggestion for the priority of Moonfire is to cast 1 on pull on the priority mob, or when pulling multiple packs of mobs together since it has a 40-yard range. While gathering early threat, make sure your Thrash can hit as many mobs as possible before using Swipe, which will then use to establish threat using direct damage. Once you go through your second rotation of Thrash, this is when you're going to be able to apply Moonfire to certain mobs. Typically, you're going to want to maintain it on both your priority target or on the target that you want to die first, as well as a few additional mobs as well. After that, you can actually use Swipe while the debuffs tick, or if you need to kite. This is when your globals will be used on both, Ursal's Vortex and Moonfire to maintain damage from afar while kiting. My general rule of thumb is to maintain Moonfire on at least 2 to 3 targets in any size pull while you're face tanking, and while kiting you want to make sure it's applied to as many targets as possible, typically all of them, unless the pull is obviously like a ridiculous size like 12 plus mobs or something like that. So I did promise that I would talk about the second time you'll use Maul, so I guess this is a good time to talk about it since I've mentioned threat generation so many times in the last minute or two. Maul is a great ability to use if a DPS happens to get aggro from you. This will typically happen earlier in the pull, especially with so many classes having insane burst damage due to Covenant abilities. If you're like me and you play with non-rogues, hunters, and mages, this might be an often occurrence. While a simple growl followed by an ability will typically be good enough for threat generation, sometimes it just isn't enough. Maul can pack a punch, especially if it lands a critical strike, and can generate a lot of threat. This is a great time to spend rage on Maul since no mobs are actually hitting you, and it's hard to get used to this, especially since in a perfect world a DPS won't go full Mongoloid before the tank hits the targets, but sometimes a Demon Hunter decides to I-beam a little too early. Just keep calm and remember that Maul isn't that bad. Alright, what else? Let's talk about Incarnation. With the potency of Earthwarden alone, Thrash is going to be your highest priority to cast during this window in any multi-target situation, and Gore proc should actually be ignored for the most part. Even though Mangle does slightly more damage and can cleave 3 targets during Incarnation, Thrash adding a defensive value with both Rend and Tear and Earthwarden is kind of a no-brainer. Once you throw in a legendary option like Ursoc's Fury Remembered, the game instantly becomes just a Thrash frenzy for 30 seconds. Let's just say you are running Galactic Guardian with a non-Thrash based legendary like Natural Order's Will, and on top of this, you're also playing Survival of the Fittest build. This makes Thrash extremely less valuable, but still not obsolete. Since we're talking about multiple targets here, Thrash will still do effectively more damage than Mangle, but your Moonfire proc will provide beneficial since additional rage will allow you to mitigate or maul at your leisure. And the direct damage is pretty insane. On top of this, it will also refresh the damage over time effect on the target, so that's obviously a plus. The value of the Moonfire procs will actually fall off as you have more and more targets added, so it should be used with caution. Typically, if you're having 3 or more targets in a pull, Thrash is going to pull ahead and is the only ability you're going to have to use during the entirety of the duration of the cooldown window. Multi-target damage, while being fairly straightforward, can fluctuate simply based on the Guardian Druid's ability to apply and maintain Moonfire. Outside of that, honestly, thrash away. But before doing a quick summary, I just want to quickly talk about trinkets. I went back and forth on doing this section, since obtaining appropriate trinkets can be a hassle, and survivability honestly trumps damage output currently, at least during Season 1. After much internal debate, I decided to quickly just talk about these trinkets that you should aim for, that will help you do more damage, but not necessarily help you defensively, so please take this with a grain of salt. Now, it's a no-brainer that if you can get your hands on a blood-splattered scale from the other side, this trinket is insanely overpowered, not only because it does a huge amount of absorption shield, so it adds survivability to your class and your toolkit, it also does really good damage that can help you with overall throughput, as well as combating aggro issues. Besides that trinket, Phial of Putrefaction from Plaguefall or Bottled Flayed-Wing Toxin from Necrotic Wake can increase your overall damage by about 3 to 5%. These trinkets need to be used with caution, since they provide no defensive value outside of the main set that they give you as a base. Keep in mind that the Phial from Plaguefall can only drop if you roll the Feral Specialization, since it's not classified as a tank trinket, but the Bottled Flayed-Wing Toxin is, so you don't have to worry about that. These are just a few good trinkets. There are some from Raid, like Hateful Chain and Dreadfire Vessel. These are from later bosses, but assuming that getting these from Heroic and Mythic for most players at the time will be extremely difficult. But those are essentially my recommendations on trinkets, but should again be taken with a grain of salt, and you should be focusing a little bit more on survivability than damage when it comes to these items. Alright, quick recap. So in single target encounters, you're going to want to maintain Moonfire damage over time effect. Use it on pull, and then reapply when there's 6 to 1 seconds left. Then, obviously, Thrash, followed by Mangle on cooldown. Use procs of Gore and Galactic Guardian as they happen if you're playing with that talent. And then fill empty globals with Swipe, and obviously any other abilities as seen fit, Frenzied Regen and whatnot. Maul then can be used on certain boss encounters with high magic damage and low physical damage, or if you have damage rush and cooldowns rolling like Barkskin or Survival Instincts. Multi-target is all about threat control. Once you have good enough threat on a pull, you still prioritize Thrash and Mangle as usual, but you're going to want to focus on maintaining Moonfire on at least 2 to 3 or more targets. Always feel free to maintain on more if you feel like you can find the globals to spare. If you're running the Galactic Guardian talent, honestly, Moonfire applications happen passively, but it's still important to use procs as they happen, and to maintain the damage over time effects on as many targets as possible. You can always fill in with Swipe or Maul if you're losing threat on multiple mobs, or Moonfire is already on every target. But that pretty much does it for this video. I hope this brought a little bit of insight into maximizing your rotation as a Guardian Druid in different situations. If I did miss anything, let me know. I'm always open to discourse in the comment section below. And obviously, if something is still confusing, or you can always message me on Discord or find me on Twitch, where I can answer questions while you watch me wipe on Mythic Progression on my off-spec. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you're staying healthy, and I will catch you all in the next one. Take care.